the intro. So for those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Peter Verteuil. I've been an EIR with New Ventures BC for a couple of years now, and also worked, for about the last 6 or 7 years in the New Ventures BC competition as both a judge and mentor. And I've got a fairly long, extensive kind of sales and marketing background with organizations like Future Shop prior to them being acquired by Best Buy, as well as Crystal Decisions, Business Objects, and SAP. So the subject of metrics and data analysis can be a pretty broad topic. So we're not going to do too much more than scratch the surface here today. In addition, every company is different. You all have different solutions, different markets, and different business models. So not everything that we discuss here will necessarily apply to your specific situation. So rather than focusing too much on whether you need to employ a specific metric, what I hope you'll come away with is more just a way of thinking about your business. So what we're going to cover today is just why data and metrics are important, some of the data sources that you'll be using for your metrics, what are some of the key metrics that you should be tracking, examples of how metrics can help you identify gaps. I'm going to talk a little bit about forecasting and then just have some other quick tips. And let's see if I can get this thing. Here we are. So why are metrics important? Well, one thing I say a lot, and people will hear me say, is that numbers tell a story, and numbers can give you insight. However, the story is not always immediately evident. Sometimes it can be somewhat hidden. So analyzing your data and metrics is a way to uncover some of the things that are happening in your business, sometimes a little bit below the surface. It can also help you identify gaps. So as you look at your strategy planning and execution, by using metrics and data analysis, you can identify what some of the gaps might be there. Also help you forecast and predict revenues. And it helps you not only kind of establish benchmarks, but review and update your benchmarks. And really, it's a performance management tool, both for the business overall, as well as for individuals, like, for instance, salespeople or sales teams. So some of the data sources that you'll be using for your metrics, and I'm going to concentrate mainly on sales metrics. There's obviously a lot of other metrics that you might be using to measure kind of the performance of your business. I'll talk a little bit about marketing as well. But the main source of data is going to be the systems that you use to operate your business. So for instance, in the case of sales, a CRM system is often the tool that you'll use. But as well, things like accounting systems, especially when you're wanting to track not only revenues, but for instance, costs and profits, marketing solutions. So solutions like HubSpot, there's others, marketing planning solutions, et cetera. There's also, BI and reporting and analytics tools like, Crystal Reports or Business Objects. The advantage of them, while sometimes a little more complex to deploy, is they're good at bringing in disparate data sources. So bringing in data from, for instance, both your CRM system and your accounting systems into a single report. And then other things such as web analytics for tracking things like, click through, et cetera, on for some of your marketing activities. When I say plans of records, I'm really talking about, if you have kind of a formal plan, like maybe a 3-year plan, 5-year plan, where you that might be kind of a formal plan that you have as far as your revenue targets, et cetera. And then the other thing is just, it could be miscellaneous Excel spreadsheets and pivot tables where you're storing data. And by the way, some organizations may not have all of these solutions. It's not unusual for a company at an early stage to not even have a CRM system. Could be that you're tracking all of these metrics in a spreadsheet, and that's fine. You can use a spreadsheet for that. The one thing I would say about your data sources is, typically, especially with CRM, it's only valuable to the extent that the information is entered both correctly and in a timely fashion. The old adage of garbage in, garbage out definitely applies with CRM systems. And by the same token, if little to no data is being entered, then again, you'll get little to no value out of them. So it's very important with CRM systems that you create a discipline around entering your data on an ongoing basis. For some reason, I'm having some issues forwarding. Here we are. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about key metrics to track as it relates to marketing. And I'm just going to spend a moment first talking about inbound versus outbound marketing. And those terms are relatively self-explanatory. But typically at its simplest form, inbound means inquiries that are coming into you from your customers. So that generally, your customers are initiating that contact, whereas outbound is you reaching out or your team reaching out to customers. And that's very much kind of a warm versus cold type of lead, hence the term cold calling when you're reaching out directly to customers who may not know you. But inbound is also used to describe a marketing strategy where you develop content such as blogs or newsletters, white papers, webinars, etc. Hopefully that your customers will find compelling and that you promote and have customers sign up for. So essentially in exchange for your content, so for instance, the ability to download a white paper or to attend a webinar, they share their contact information. So basically have now opted in to being on your mailing list, and thus essentially authorizes you to contact them. So this is another form of, even though you may now do outreach outbound to them, because they've authorized you through your kind of content management, your inbound marketing strategy, for you to contact them by sharing their contact information. It's kind of a warmer way to get engagement and conversation with those customers. So marketing metrics do depend quite a bit on the type of media and methodology you're doing. So, you may be doing social media such as Facebook or LinkedIn, or, search, either paid or organic, or even traditional media like radio or print. The key thing is it's important to understand, where your leads and opportunities are coming from. So especially if you're doing, multiple types of marketing at the same time, multiple channels, it's really critical to know, which one of those is actually being the most effective. So some of that can be done quite easily through things such as landing pages, et cetera, where you track how customers come in. Other times you may just have to ask the customers because it may not be evident. One thing that is important is as you start planning a campaign, it's important to think about how you're going to measure its effectiveness or results. And so that's, because really, there's an old adage in advertising that 50% of your marketing spend is ineffective. It's just nobody knows which 50%. So, that was more really around traditional mass media. But it can be the same even with this, with digital marketing. If you don't know where your leads are coming from, then you may be kind of, spending ineffectively or overspending on things that aren't working for you. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the whole topic of leads versus qualified leads and opportunities. I used to go sometimes to conferences where I'd see people offering, a free iPad to anybody that allows them to scan their badge. And people would come away from those conferences saying they had literally thousands of leads. But in my mind, those were never leads. That's, yes, it's contact information, but you don't know if those people are even, in your market, if they're qualified at all. So I don't consider those to be leads. They may be potential suspects. But to me, a lead is somebody who's in your market and at least has the potential to have some interest in your product. And so really what's more important is qualified leads. And that's, again, talking about, who are the customers who are in the market for your solution, or at least, fit the profile of your customer. And then typically and oftentimes you may get those kind of what I'd say more random leads, and then you may have somebody, you may go through a process through either kind of email communication or people reaching out to them, calling them to try to qualify whether they're in your market or not, and then that becomes kind of what I would call a sales qualified lead. And typically, in my opinion, an opportunity is when a customer, you're actually engaged with the customer in a dialogue about your solution, or for instance, they're attending a demo. I would consider that then to be an opportunity. Now, a lot of different companies treat those things a little bit differently, and so there's no kind of one answer or solution to that. But it is important that when you're talking to your teams, that you're all speaking the same language as to what's an opportunity versus a lead. Um, Another kind of key thing to think about, and this is more appropriate for SaaS solutions, but oftentimes you may offer either a freemium solution, so a free version with maybe a less featured version, which is offered for free, or a trial offering, which oftentimes is the full full featured solution, but only available for a certain period of time, like 30 days. So it's important to track those as well, both to understand kind of, again, how your marketing is helping to drive those users, but then also to understand how many of those convert to a paid solution. So and the other thing is to be aware of is that freemium customers, there still may be a cost associated with just supporting them, whether that's either onboarding or just through whatever your web servers you have to do to support those customers. So it's important to understand how your marketing efforts are driving both freemium and trial users, and even more so what your conversion rate is from those to paid users. The other thing that's important to understand, and this is really a combination of both marketing and maybe your sales costs, but really what is your customer acquisition costs? If you're spending $2,000 in marketing for every kind of customer you close, well, that's great if you have a product that sells for tens of thousands of dollars, or even $5,000. But if you're spending that kind of money on a solution that really that only sells for $2,000, then obviously you're not going to be profitable. So it's very important to understand what your customer acquisition costs are. And I'll talk a little bit more by segment, but what I mean by segment is that if you have different categories of customers, so you may, for instance, have a solution for small and medium-sized businesses and more of an enterprise solution that maybe sells at quite a bit different price point. It's fine to have a more costly customer acquisition cost, maybe for the enterprise customers, but you want to keep it lower for the SMB solutions. So understanding your customer acquisition cost by segment is quite important. Now on the sales side, there's a few kind of key metrics, and the one thing to understand is what are the benchmarks you're using, and they're benchmarks can come from your own historical data. So if you have existing sales data, you can develop your benchmarks just based on that. If you don't have that, if you're just kind of coming to market, then you may look to industry or competitive data to get an understanding of what other solutions are selling for. And it can also just be a best guess, or an estimate of what you think things like your average sales price and your sales cycle might be. So just like a lot of other things in the startup world, you may be starting with an assumption when it comes to your benchmarks, and it's something you need to prove over time. So in my mind, the key ones you want to be tracking is, first of all, your average deal size. So that's a key stat that you need to know. And again, my recommendation is if you sell into key differentiated segments, like for instance SMB versus enterprise, you want to look at that by segment. The problem is if you blend them all together, you're not really going to have an accurate number for either. So you're much better to to segment those. And that might be by region, it might be by solution if you have multiple solutions. The one thing is to be careful not to get too crazy about segmentation, because you also want to have enough numbers so that your data is relatively accurate. And I'll talk a little bit about the law of small versus big numbers later. Um, so average deal size is one key thing. Conversion ratio is also important, and that's also oftentimes called closing ratio, and typically that means opportunities to sales, not necessarily leads to sales. So it's again, how many customers are you actually engaged with that you maybe do a demo for? How many of those ultimately buy? So that would be your closing or conversion ratio. Now you may also want to track things like leads to sales, just to understand what those are, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those other metrics as well. The other thing that's very important is what your sales cycle is. So on average, how long does it take for you to take your customer through that whole kind of opportunity process? And that for some solutions can be literally, a day. Some are almost instantaneous in the case of kind of e-commerce solutions, but more complex solutions can be easily weeks or months, and it's not uncommon for certain software solutions to be 6 to 9 months. So it's very important to understand that, because that'll help you with your forecasting and understanding how and when your deals are going to be coming in. The other thing that's really important, from my perspective, and something that some companies I don't think focus on enough, is actually having specific targets. So what are the numbers that you're actually trying to achieve? And that's kind of pretty critical in my mind. I recommend that people really actually have a 3-year plan. But for kind of forecasting purposes, you really want to have I'd say a 4-quarter plan with specific targets, and preferably detailed targets by quarter, and in some cases you may even want targets by month. So definitely an important thing for people to think about. And if you don't have a formal plan of record with kind of specific targets, my recommendation is you establish one, or at least establish targets for the current quarter and a couple quarters out. Another thing that you want to be doing is forecasting. So that's not only, so you want to be able to track your historical numbers. So for instance, if you look at this quarter, we're almost closing Q4 of 2020. By the end of this quarter, you want to know what your actual numbers were. So what's your actual average deal size? What was your actual conversion ratio? But you also want to be able to forecast what your likely revenues are going to be for next quarter. And I'm going to step you through a little bit some very simple kind of forecasting methodologies. Typically, your forecast is done by quarter. It's a little more complicated to do it by month, and I don't typically recommend doing it by month, but you could certainly can do it by quarter. So the other thing to look at on an ongoing basis is what is your achievement against plan. So again, if you have a target, you know what you achieved, then what is that percentage as far as your achievement against plan, both looking at it historically as well as you look at your forecast. What is your forecasted achievement against plan, for instance, for Q1 2021? And then also to look at your year-over-year growth. So looking at the same period, what is your growth this year over last year? Now, I know in lots of cases, startups may not have revenues for last year, but it is something to kind of continue to take a look at as you kind of continue on. I mentioned earlier the concept of trial or paid user conversion to paid. So again, that's a key number that you want to track. And then, as I mentioned earlier about segments, if you are breaking your business into specific segments, and again, it may not be appropriate in all cases, but where it is appropriate, you should both break your plan and your forecast into those segments. So again, in the example that I gave earlier, if you have a small and medium-sized business, segment, and you have an enterprise segment, you want to build your targets as well as your forecasts and track your actuals by segment. So, one of the reasons why we kind of spend so much time looking at numbers, and I know, different people have a different kind of comfort level with numbers. Um, but, the advantage of looking at numbers is it helps you identify gaps. Um, so I mentioned here, if you're not hitting your objectives, the numbers can often guide you. By the way, this talks to more like people who are not performing as they expect, but also if you're performing well, um, doing that same kind of analysis can also uncover opportunities or areas where maybe you are falling short and that you are not maximizing your potential. So even if you're overachieving on your numbers, doing this kind of analysis and understanding your metrics, understanding where you may be falling short is important to look at. So one of the key things that your numbers can tell you is, do you have enough pipeline to hit your target? So are there literally, do you have enough opportunities in your pipeline to achieve, your quarterly targets? So that to me is a key factor which you can look at, early on in the quarter and understand, what the likelihood is of you hitting your objectives. And then if you don't have enough, and I'm going to actually step you through kind of a simple calculation on that. If you don't have enough, then what are the levers you can pull? Can you drive additional lead generation? Are there other things you can do to help you achieve your objectives? The other thing it can tell you is again, is your lead generation strategy sufficient? And also kind of the timing of those. So one thing you need to take in consideration is your if you have a long sales cycle, um, if you don't, you may need to be building pipeline and developing leads, 2 or 3 quarters out potentially. So you need to think about not only the current quarter, but is your lead generation strategy sufficient to carry you kind of through the momentum that you need to continue? Also, are you targeting the right customers? So one thing, if you, for instance, have a lot of leads, but very few of those leads are converting into opportunities, similar to the example I gave about the free iPad at the conference, it could be that these are just not the right customers, and so that can be an indication or a gap that your marketing strategies are not really hitting the right target. Um, the other thing is if you find that you're getting lots of opportunities, but you're not. Excuse me, sorry. If you're getting lots of opportunities, but you're not closing many, then that could be an issue with your value proposition. Maybe there's something either in the way you're communicating it, or in fact that it's just not compelling enough to customers. The other thing is it can indicate in some cases that there's something wrong in your sales process. So for instance, if you're running into situations where you're running into a lot of objections maybe late in the sales cycle, it could be that you're not asking the right questions early on in your qualification process. The other thing that's worth looking at is, are deals stalling? And when I say stalling, it means a deal is at a certain stage for a long period of time. It's not progressing at all. And if that's the case, it can sometimes indicate, an issue. So for instance, if deals are stalling at a very early stage, again, you've maybe done a demo, but then you can't get customers to engage after that. It could be that they don't find your solution to be compelling, or your value proposition to be compelling. On the other hand, if it's typically at a later stage, so they've had numerous discussions with you, and there seems to be interest, but it's stalling late, then often it might just be a pricing issue, or a contracting issue, or some concerns about onboarding, et cetera. So it's worth looking at what stage are your deals stalling, if that's the case. The other thing that's important to think about, especially in a SaaS situation, is churn and customer adoption. So even once you close your deals, customer adoption is a very clear indicator of future churn. So if you have low customer adoption, if they're not utilizing your solution on an ongoing basis, if there's not engagement with your solution, then there's a very high likelihood that you're going to experience churn, which just means that, a customer essentially giving up on you. And churn can be a killer in a SaaS business, because obviously the valuation on the business and the whole value proposition of SaaS is building kind of a growing recurring revenue stream. So if you're getting a lot of churn and all you're doing is replacing kind of those existing customers, then you're never realizing the potential of your SaaS business model. So customer adoption is also kind of an important stat, even though it's not truly a sales stat, but it's a core stat in kind of the utilization of your solution. So I'm going to talk just a little bit here, go through a bit of a short forecasting exercise. So this is a little bit of a math part of this presentation, but I'm going to try to keep it short and simple. And I know that again, certain people have different levels of kind of comfort with numbers and with math. I'm going to take you through kind of two different viewpoints on these numbers, and one is what I would call more of a bottoms up perspective, where you look at the number of opportunities in hand and what that might deliver as far as revenue. And then the other one is more of a tops down approach, where you start with your target, and then from there you try to understand how many opportunities you might need. So I'm just going to quickly step you through this. At the beginning part, a forecast is essentially a pretty simple thing. It's kind of the number of opportunities that you will have in a certain period of time. So if typically you're forecasting on a quarterly basis, it's the number of opportunities in that quarter times the average deal value times your closing ratio. So in this example I'm showing here, if you have 10 opportunities and your average deal value is $5,000, then the total potential of those 10 opportunities, essentially the pipeline value, would be $50,000. And then if you have a closing ratio of 30%, then that would mean your forecast is $15,000. So that's a pretty straightforward, calculation. The one thing you need to take into consideration again is sales cycle. So, one way, obviously, if you wanted to increase that number, is to increase the number of opportunities. And so you might say, well, gee, I can generate a whole bunch of more leads. And so now I'm going to have 30 opportunities this quarter. And that's one way to increase, my revenues for the quarter and my forecast. And that's true. The only issue is if you have, for instance, a 90-day sales cycle or longer, then it's very difficult for you to generate leads in this quarter, which are going to result in sales this quarter. So again, sales cycle is very critical. On the other hand, if you have a 30-day sales cycle, it's certainly possible that you could have additional opportunities in the current quarter that are going to drive additional revenues. So then you need to start thinking about forecasting, what additional opportunities might come in that are not, yet, available or that you have insight into. The other thing to understand is when you are forecasting, the more accurate way to do it, rather than just taking your overall sales cycle, is to look at a risk-adjusted number by stage. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but typically in the CRM system, you have multiple stages. So it might be, for instance, initial contact might be one. It might be demo, demo completed. It might be a kind of follow-up. It might be contract negotiation, or whatever. So you can have multiple stages. And what you can do is apply a risk-adjusted number at each stage. So it could be that at the very early stage, when you've had initial contact, you may forecast that it's 0. If once you've done a demo, you might say it's a 10% likelihood to close, and at final contract negotiation, it might be 90% likely to close. And so then you can actually adjust each opportunity based on its stage and use what we call a risk-adjusted number. And that's typically more accurate, but that's only true if you have a fairly large number of opportunities you're managing. And then the other thing to think about, as I mentioned earlier, if you go through this whole process and look at what your forecast is, then what is your forecast versus plan? So in this instance, if you have 10 opportunities and you have a long sales cycle, like longer than 90 days, so you have a $15,000 forecast, if your plan is $50,000, then you're likely to fall short. And then you have to look at what are the things you could do to adjust that, or is that in fact is your target realistic? So the other way to look at that again is to start with the target, and this is a way to understand how many opportunities you need in order to hit your target. So it's essentially just doing that same calculation in reverse. You start with your target. In this case, I'm saying $50,000. Divide it by your average deal size, which is 5,000. So that would mean you would need 10 opportunities, to close, and then divide by your closing ratio, which in this case at 30% would mean you would need 33 opportunities would be required on average for you to actually hit a target of 50,000. So again, the best case scenario is that when you enter the quarter, you already have those 33 opportunities, you're working those. But again, if you have a shorter sales cycle, you may be able to start with a lower number of opportunities, generate lots of opportunities throughout the quarter and still close them. But it's worth looking at this on an ongoing basis in the context of your sales cycle. So it gives you a good understanding of what the likelihood is of you hitting your number. And then also, again, to think ahead to future quarters, what do you need to do to put in place to make sure you're driving enough lead generation so you have enough opportunities to hit your objectives in the future. And again, as I mentioned earlier, where feasible, break all of this down by segment. You can look at opportunities by segment, average deal size by segment, closing ratio by segment, etc. So just some additional kind of tips and things to think about. First of all, is get comfortable and familiar with your numbers. Like I say, some people have a higher level of comfort with numbers, others are not so much. If you struggle with numbers and metrics and data analysis, just start with one or two metrics and get familiar with them. So what is your average deal size by segment? And then once you're comfortable and you understand that, then look at, hey, what's my closing ratio? How successful am I in closing these deals? So the more you can get familiar with those kind of core metrics, then it's going to get much easier for you to both understand kind of what's going on in your business as well as how to forecast. The other thing that's important is to, every now and then you may have outliers in your business. So for instance, you may have a average deal size of, whatever, $10,000, but you have one large deal that closes, which is great, for $100,000. So the problem with that is it can mess up your benchmarks a little bit. So if you're calculating your average deal size and you're factoring that $100,000 deal in with all of the $10,000 deals, then it might falsely indicate that you have a higher average deal value than what's normally the case. And so my recommendation is that for both setting your benchmarks as well as when you're forecasting, that you remove those outliers and you just kind of forecast on the normal part of the business. And like I say, you can forecast that deal is kind of a separate thing, but for your normal calculations that you remove those outliers. The other thing is, I recommend is you forecast conservatively. You're much better typically to be conservative and overachieve than to kind of be very aggressive. Again, I'm talking more from a forecasting point of view than to kind of be aggressive and underachieve. The other thing to keep in mind, and this relates to benchmarks as well, is this concept of reversion to the mean. So that this is a very kind of standard, law or rule in statistics, where if numbers kind of highly either overperform or underperform, there's kind of a tendency for them to revert to the mean. And a good way to look at that is kind of a sports analogy. So if you have a hockey player who on average, scores a point a game and then has a 5 point game, just has a great game, you don't expect him to all of a sudden score 5 points every day beyond that, or every game. You'd expect him to revert back to his average. And by the same token, if you have a hockey player and he's in a slump and he hasn't scored for 5 games, again, you don't expect that he's never going to score again. You expect that he's going to revert to the mean, which means he's, again, he'll get back to kind of his average. So this is often the case with kind of numbers in general. And so it's one reason why I recommend you don't if all of a sudden you have a month where your average deal value has doubles, don't necessarily think that your benchmark should be changing immediately and that every deal is going to double. You may just have some anomalies there and they're going to revert back to the mean. So it is important to review, and update your benchmarks, on a somewhat regular basis. I recommend you do it at least annually. And it could be that some fundamental things are changing in your business. And in fact, those benchmarks should change. But just be careful not to do it too often. Don't do it, like I say, as soon as, something seems to change in the business. I wouldn't necessarily, change your benchmarks immediately. You want to kind of review that for a period of time and make sure that things actually have fundamentally changed. I mentioned earlier about having quarterly targets. So again, I recommend you actually have annual targets, at least for a couple of years. So, certainly I'd say for 2021, I would recommend that you have an annual target that you're trying to achieve, and preferably for a couple of years beyond that. And then for the current year, meaning in this case now, as we're moving into 2021, have those targets broken down by quarter and possibly even monthly. Although, like I say, I typically don't recommend that you forecast on a monthly basis, just because it's hard to tell when deals will come in, like when you get into a very kind of short time frame like that. But it's important, at least on a quarterly basis, to be tracking that. Another thing is be careful of the terminology, and this is really more kind of inside your business. So people talk about, sales and revenues or bookings or ACV, which is annual contract value, or annual recurring revenue. MRR is monthly recurring revenue. And these are all, fine numbers. The problem is some people kind of mix them up a little bit. And so, for instance, revenues is really an accounting term, and your accounting people might be thinking of it, on the basis of kind of the deferred revenues when it's actually being recognized from an accounting point of view. And you might be thinking of things more as kind of the bookings, when the full value of the deal is actually, being invoiced, or based on the annual contract value. And it's fine to use all of these different terms. It's just really important to make sure everybody's on the same page. And have seen situations where people are kind of, one person is talking in terms of the annual contract value of a deal, somebody else is thinking in terms of the actual recognized revenue, and they're actually talking kind of two different numbers and don't realize it. So it's just important that everybody's clear on their terminology, and that and it doesn't kind of create confusion. The one thing I would say is Excel is a very powerful tool. I use Excel a lot, even when I worked for, Business Objects, who was the world leader in business analytics. I still used Excel a lot. It's a very powerful tool. Pivot tables are a very powerful way of kind of quickly analyzing data. So, my recommendation is to get familiar with Excel, get familiar with the kind of the simple formulas that Excel can do. And it's a very powerful tool, not only for kind of analyzing your data, but also doing what if scenarios for planning and forecasting. The other thing that I would kind of reiterate, and I'm sure some of you are realizing this, that oftentimes building pipeline can be a bigger challenge than closing deals. So I focus a lot on sales, but the lead generation and the opportunity development piece of sales, it can't be overstated. It's very critical. And again, this is as you start building out your targets, understanding how many opportunities you might need or a salesperson might need to be engaged in order to achieve those targets is really critical. And so you need to be thinking well in advance of what are you doing to build the pipeline to make sure you've got kind of that lead flow that'll allow you to meet your objectives. Another metric that some people, we used to track some of our salespeople on is case studies and referenceable customers. So again, this is kind of a measure of customer success, but it is something we used to actually every now and then spiff or provide bonuses to our salespeople in order to get them to get their customers to be referenceable, or to develop a case study. So it might be a metric that's worth thinking about, is how many of your customers are referenceable, or could you create a case study on, because it will give you some idea of customer success and maybe the type of word of mouth that you might get from those customers. If you have a very low number of customers that you think are referenceable, then it may be kind of raise some concerns about the level of customer success. And that also can lead to things like potential churn. And then the other thing that I would just add, this is kind of my last note, is sometimes you can get kind of too focused on the numbers. And so it's important to understand that the business is not just all about numbers. It's obviously a lot about, personal interaction. And I think it's really critical, especially as deals close, that you continue to celebrate success. It can, like I say, can sometimes be very easy to just think about the numbers and move on to the next quarter without really thinking about how to celebrate success. So that's a key part in motivating people and maintaining momentum. So that's it for my presentation. I hope it's been useful. I guess we will open it up now for questions. And